Hello and welcome to the two-man power trip of wrestling. My host, JP John Poz. With me today, special guest. He is, of course, an author, a wrestling historian, and we're going to be talking about his new book, The Irresistible Force, The Life and Times of Gorilla Monsoon. He is Mr. Brian R. Solomon. Brian, welcome back. How you doing?
Thanks, John. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me back.
We were just talking not that long ago about this epic book here. This is great. Gorilla, how's it going now? You're starting to see a lot of positivity regarding this awesome book.
Yeah, it officially comes out on Tuesday, September 30th. So there's been this big build, and now, people are starting to get their hands on it, some early copies and trickling out to various places. And it's all been great feedback so far. I'm very excited.
When you obviously are putting this together, Gorilla Monsoon is such a legend, but there's also this kind of weird thing that is kind of matriculating or circulating. He wasn't on the Wrestling Observer ballot, right? Because he was kicked off of it for a while. What is going on with that? Because I wanted to kind of touch on that early on here, just to kind of get your feeling on that.
Sure. Well, he got dropped off the ballot because he never got voted in. So he was put on the original ballot. And, the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame was established in 1996. And the original lineup was chosen by Dave Meltzer himself, just kind of like the gigantic shoe-in people, Bruno Sammartino, Lou Thesz, Frank Gotch, like those kind of figures that to make sure they were in there. And then it was opened up to voting year by year. And the truth is that Gorilla Monsoon never got the sufficient amount of votes to get in. So you have to be on more than 2/3 of the ballots to get in. And that never happened. And so, like with other halls of fame, because that hall of fame is voted on in similar fashion to the way sports hall of fames are done, like the baseball one. And so if a certain amount of years passes by, I think it's like 10 years, and you're not voted in, then what happens is you have to get at least 50% of the votes. Otherwise, you get dropped completely. And that's what happened. I believe it was 2015 or 16 or something. He was dropped off the ballot. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't ever add you back if there's reason to, if there's a good enough push for it or whatever, they can put you back on. And I know that Dave said to me personally that he was going to be putting him back on this year, largely because of the book and because of a lot of people talking and the reappraisals and stuff, just to see what would happen. So now he's back on the ballot again for the first time in years. He's in the non-wrestlers category, which I think makes sense, because if you have to pick one category, and you do, otherwise he would cancel himself out and would never get enough votes. But the idea is that the non-wrestling stuff is what he's most known for. And on top of that, it's also, particularly because of the behind-the-scenes stuff, it's also his most important contribution to wrestling. So I understand why he's in the non-wrestler category as opposed to the historical wrestler category.
Just throwing this out there, and I hate to reveal this, but in my ballot, because Dave Meltzer sent it to me, and I did vote for Gorilla Monsoon. So
I will be too. I haven't sent mine in yet, but he will be on it, of course, right at the top.
Yeah, I feel like man, it's like that's, and Kevin Sullivan, good old friend of mine, was on there too. I'm like, those two got to get in. Come on, what are we doing here? Come on, guys, get those two in there. Especially Gorilla. I was like, wow, it's just crazy that he was off because he didn't have enough votes. But why wouldn't he get enough votes? That's kind of my point of contention. Well, what's going on with some of these observer people?
And this is why I think he'll go in now, because there's some figures that are reappraised in later years. Now, we forget this, but there was a time when some of the most beloved wrestling figures that are now pretty like universally beloved at the time were not by a certain segment of fans, of insider fans, newsletter reading fans, smart fans, whatever you want to call them. And that's happened all through, the last 40 years of wrestling history. There's people now who at the time were not thought of as highly as they are now. Dusty Rhodes is another example. He had a lot of critics and detractors back in the day when he was active in the business. And now, that view has sort of really become silenced, and he's much more universally beloved now all these years later. There's a lot of that. Even if you go back to the early observers and things, Dave is critical even of Gordon Soley, for example, as a commentator. And I mean, he's generally considered to be the greatest of all time now by a large number of fans who were around at the time. And Gorilla was like that too. He was he won in the Wrestling Observer newsletter, he won worst announcer, something like 6 or 7 times, which is the record holder still. And this is baffling to a lot of fans, the idea of that. And for example, you know, there's a segment of fans, I think, that feel this way, but a lot of times these opinions, I think, exist in a vacuum or a bubble. And it's important to understand that that is and always was a tiny fraction of wrestling fandom. That if you talk to the overwhelming majority of people who grew up watching the WWF in the 80s and 90s, that Gorilla Monsoon has a very dear place in their heart. So I'm hoping that now, all these years later, with nostalgia, with those younger fans getting older, and hopefully with the help of my book, that he'll get in easily, because he's one of those names that people see on that ballot sometimes and they can't understand how he's not already in. But you know, that kind of the way that he was talked about in the Observer, I think, influenced the readers of the Observer. You know, and I talked to Dave about that too when I had him on my podcast. That's, you know, if you're reading that, and I've read it for many, many years, and I think a lot of people read it and I read it, and I think Dave Meltzer and the Observer is a treasure. I think it's an incredibly valuable thing. And but there are people, I think, who come away from it thinking this is the only way to view pro wrestling. These are the only valid opinions. And I think you don't want to do that with anybody. You know, like I always said, the problem, because people will criticize Dave and the Observer, the problem isn't that the Observer exists. The problem was that there weren't 10 different Observers out there by 10 different Dave Meltzers with 10 different opinions. That's the thing. And so the people that are in that bubble, you know, they all hated Gorilla Monsoon. And it wasn't even also even in the wrestling magazines back in the day, in the After magazines. They used to trash him. I know Peter King, who was the editor-in-chief there, used to trash him in the magazine. And I know those guys were reading the Observer too in the offices. So, you know, again, like sometimes we forget that these opinions were strongly expressed back in the day. Nowadays they would seem sort of silly, but that's what it was.
I mean, I'm in my early to mid 40s here, so I'm a huge Gorilla Monsoon fan. Grew up in New Jersey, so Northeast guy, WWF guy, and I just thought he was the best. Like I always thought how great he was.
What Dave has sometimes said is that he would get complaints from wrestlers in the WWF, who would talk to him and complain about Gorilla on commentary because they felt that he was burying them. Because as we know, Gorilla was not afraid to be critical. He did things that commentators in wrestling typically don't do, and nowadays they're not even allowed to do most of the time. If a hold was put on wrong or sloppy or whatever, he would say it. If a cover was bad, he would say it. And he would really, but even the heels back in the day would really rip on the faces, the heel announcers, Bobby Heenan, Jesse Ventura, and Gorilla would lay into the heels. And, he was looking out for his own credibility as an announcer. He didn't want to call things that fans could see through because he knew then they wouldn't trust him. And also, he was part of the office. And, he had a very high standard for what he saw in the ring. He would criticize referees. He would criticize everybody. He wanted people to trust in what he had to say. And he tried to call wrestling like a sport, especially in his early years as a commentator. Like if you're watching baseball or basketball and somebody does a bad play or there's an error or something, they're going to call them out. If a team's playing bad ball, they're going to point it out. And I know a lot of times in wrestling, that's not the philosophy. The philosophy is you got to cover for the flaws, not accentuate them. But, Gorilla was trying to be like a sports announcer. And I think, that wasn't always super popular with all the talent.
man, it's just like crazy to think like, wow, people didn't like Gorilla, just from my perspective of just loving him so
I
much and
know.
thinking like
It
how
is
great of an announcer he
astonishing.
was.
No, I agree. It's really shocking if you've never been inside that bubble and you've never read newsletters, you've never been on message boards and all that kind of stuff. It is this weird thing. It's like when you go back to 1964 and you read like in the newspapers and people have found these things where TV critics trashing the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, just like how could Ed Sullivan put this kind of garbage on the air? What's happening to this once great show? And we look at that now and it's like, completely bizarre. Or whenever you read bad reviews of movies from long ago that are now universally loved, every movie gets some bad reviews. Or sometimes you find out that certain movies were panned. The Wizard of Oz was panned. Star Wars got a ton of bad reviews. A lot of things like that. I remember, look, I was a kid in the 80s. Scarface was an embarrassment. It was destroyed by critics. It was considered one of the most notorious bombs of all time. They laughed at Al Pacino's Tony Montana performance. And now that movie has been elevated into like some type of modern day classic, which I will admit baffles me. But but not the other example. I think it's a terrible movie, but we're not talking about that. But you get what I mean.
It's not Heat or something, you know what I mean? It's not Pacino's best, but
it's like a silly, goofy cartoon.
Yeah,
I don't know how
yeah.
people take it seriously. I just don't get it.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. That's for sure. I just love that some things can be a classic now, and then like you're saying, you look back then and people just rip it apart. Like, wow, that's different. Like, wow, I thought it was a classic. Like, I thought Monsoon was a classic.
I'll never forget. I found this book once, this movie review book from the 70s, or maybe the early 80s, and it was written by this guy named Hallowell, who was like a real old time movie critic. Like he was old then, when he wrote the book, and he's in there trashing all the movies of my youth that I thought everybody loved, like trashing Raiders of the Lost Ark, trashing Star Wars, trashing Jaws, trashing Superman, all that kind of stuff. And, if you dig deep, you realize that for the old guard movie critics who had come up in classic Hollywood, that was pretty much the general consensus. Like, these movies are all garbage. They're for kids. What happened to real movies? What happened to Hollywood? This is all just a lot of fantasy nonsense. That was the general consensus among an older generation, and they're all gone. I mean, my grandparents felt that way about all those movies. They thought they were stupid, ridiculous for children. Why are all these grown-ups going to see a movie that's for kids? And those people are gone, and those kind of opinions have been kind of eclipsed by the people that grew up with those movies. So again, this is all to say, this crazy detour, that opinions can drastically change over time. And I hope that in this case, it helps to Gorilla to finally get in there and for this omission to be corrected.
When you look at it, and you were mentioning it with some of the guys complaining about Gorilla, did he ever get heat for it? Or did he ever get in trouble for any
No.
comments that he was making about the wrestlers?
None, and I'm sure he couldn't have cared less if he even knew what the Observer was. I think you have to remember he was protected there. He was part of the inner circle there. He had lifetime job security. He was a trusted associate of the McMahon family. Nothing bad is going to happen to him. In fact, I even wrote in the book about how, even the types of things that Vince is known to do with his commentators, he would never try to pull on Gorilla. Not in a million years. He's not going to be in Gorilla's headset yelling at him or telling him what to do, because Gorilla would take the headset off and just go home, and he'd still continue to collect a paycheck. And it would still be probably pretty much the same amount. That was the kind of deal that he had set up. He was there because he wanted to be there. So he was able to say and do what he wanted. Now, I'm sure that he took direction, and I know there were times when, and because he was very loyal and obedient, where, he was asked to do certain things or call certain things a certain way. I'm not saying he was difficult or obstinate or anything, but he's not somebody that was going to be worried about catching heat. I never once heard the slightest whiff of anything like that, of him catching any kind of heat with the office for anything ever.
I loved watching some of the Coliseum videos where it's not necessarily like an important match or important going on. He will literally rip apart, like he's like Rene Goulet. This guy was a wrestler. It's like this guy. I look at this guy, like, and he's just an agent. He's just breaking up a fight or something, and he'll just rip apart. He'll be like Tony Gurria. Oh, this guy. Like he would just rip guys, and almost for his own like laughter, almost to make himself pop.
Some of that was ribbing for sure, for sure. You know, I talked to Tony, and Tony loved him. Tony used to go to their house and have dinner, and they really looked out for him because he had come from New Zealand and he was so far away from his family, and he was very homesick. And they were very kind to him, the Morello family. And so I think it's like the Pat Patterson jokes and stuff like that. I think a lot of that was ribbing.
Yeah, did Pat know that he was going to say any of that? Like, hey, watch your back around this guy and stuff
I
like that.
I don't think he knew, but he didn't. He certainly didn't mind. I actually heard from his biographer, Bertrand Hebert, who I'm good friends with, who said that Pat told him about that and just said it was just all in good fun. And he never took it personally. It was just friends kidding around with each other. It was just breaking balls, you know? And, you know, it was just, it wasn't anything mean-spirited, and he knew that.
The funny thing is, like me as the viewer, or a lot of the viewers, had no idea what he was talking about. You know what I mean?
Which is why he did it, right?
Yes, inside joke. Yeah,
yeah. Because so none of that stuff had even at the time he was doing those jokes. None of that, all the sex scandal stuff. None of that had come out, and certainly after it did, he was not making those jokes anymore.
Right. I just thought that was like so funny. He would just kind of be like inside baseball, and basically, you know, maybe Heenan knows what he's talking about, or Jesse or somebody, but he would just be, you know, ripping guys and just having fun, basically.
I think it was his way of coping too with things as well. Not in the case of Patterson, but in other cases where I know there were things going on in the company that he was really appalled at, like the Terry Garvin stuff and the Mel Phillips stuff, privately appalled at it. But yet he made jokes about both those guys on the air. I mean, everybody knows about the Terry Garvin School of Self-Defense, but he also used to say things sometimes like Mel Phillips, you know, is going to get his foot in the door or something like that, or, you know, that sort of thing. So, I mean, he knew these kind of things were going on, and I think, you know, he knew there was no way he could stop it. So he kind of just chose to be quiet, like a lot of guys did. I mean, that's the way the business was at the time. And I think the only way you could deal with it is to have some type of gallows humor about it. I think that's the way a lot of those guys thought.
What was his relationship like with Vince Jr., just in general? I know they had the business dealings, but what was his relationship like with Vince?
I think it changed over time. I think in the early years, they were very wary of each other, you know, like back in the 70s, because Vince was the promoter's son. And Gorilla was the right-hand man of the promoter and pretty much the guy that was going to take over. I mean, that was the thinking. And obviously we know Vince did not want that to happen, and he made sure that didn't happen. So that created some complications in the beginning. They weren't the best of friends. And Gino was pretty pissed off when that first happened. But I think they grew to respect each other, and they grew to look at each other, you know, as friends. And I'm sure that they loved each other, but you know, it's complicated. It's a complicated relationship. Like even talking with the family, you could just tell that there was definitely skepticism there. There was definitely a lot of eye rolling and privately. And, you know, they were two big egos, two alpha type personalities. I wouldn't say Gorilla had an ego, but alpha type personalities, very competent individuals. And, you know, Gorilla knew that he was making the best money of his career and kind of tolerated it. But I think in his heart of hearts that he kind of always held him at a distance just a bit. It wasn't quite like the relationship, say, with someone like a Freddie Blassie, who Vince loved almost like a father. I witnessed that. I was there. Freddie was there when I worked there still. And I wouldn't quite call it that with Gorilla. I think he definitely had a lot of respect for him, but it was different. They were also closer in age. That's another thing people may not really comprehend. They were only 8 years apart. So he was really more like a big brother than a father type figure, you know, and definitely a rival in their early years.
When you look at it too, it's like Gorilla thinks he's taken over. The kid takes over, and there's got to be
Yes.
some animosity there. Like that. That's huge. It's like the guy is older, he's wiser, he's been around longer. He thinks he's gonna. He had his own territory basically within the WWF.
Yeah, that's the way that the WWF was set up in those days. It was almost like a mini NWA. They were different sections, and that guys would run. The Savoldis had parts of New England. Willie Gilzenberg had North Jersey. Arnie Skolin had Westchester. I mean, like it was carved up like that. Phil Zacco, parts of Pennsylvania, and he would do the TV tapings. Gorilla had South Jersey, Eastern Pennsylvania, and Delaware. That was kind of his to run. And when I say his to run, I mean, like, especially under Vince Sr., they were his shows. Like, he made the money from those shows, and he would use talent from the Capitol booking office, and based on the TV, obviously, and the angles and things. And I'm sure that the corporation got a cut from it, but those were like a booking fee or whatever. But those were his shows, and he lived and died by those shows. So he was an honest to goodness promoter as well.
When you look at that, right, Vince is going to be taking that part of his life away, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just like he's kind of completely changing his fortunes here.
He consolidated everything. So not only did he buy out his shares, because at the time of the buyout, Gorilla Monsoon owned 20% of the company. And Vince bought everyone out, all the partners. So now he doesn't have his shares. Vince is bringing everything in-house, one central office. So there's no more. I mean, they're still working with local promoters, but there's no more, this is your territory. This is yours. You have your rings. You have your. No, there's none of that anymore. So he lost his rings. He owned the rings. So Vince bought the rings from him, and he was now just an employee, and he was very keenly aware of that at first and not happy. I think it wasn't until he first started seeing how much of a success it was becoming and how much his deal that he got was paying off for him that he calmed down finally.
Crazy, like to think what could have happened had Gorilla taken over. You know what I mean? Like, and not Vince, because obviously Vince had the foresight with cable, right? It probably would have went in a completely different direction. It still would have been territorial.
Yeah, I think about that a lot. I don't think that Gorilla had the same kind of ambitions as Vince, and I don't think he was as cutthroat, like he was going to be looking to put all these people out of business. But, I do think there would be some expansion, because as we all know, the territories were sort of collapsing anyway for other reasons. I think what probably would have happened would have been a little more conservative, but I think there still would have been some expansion. I don't think he was going to step on people's toes, though. I think what we probably would have seen is wrestling would still be somewhat regional, but there would be maybe 3 or 4 major companies in the United States and Canada that would run wrestling. It would sort of almost be like the circus. There's Ringling Brothers, which is the biggest circus, but there's other circuses that go around. It would kind of be that. And so my guess is for the ones that had the best chance of survival, you might still have the AWA. You might still have World Class if the Von Erichs could hold it together. You might still have Mid-South, let's say, or Crockett, of course. So you might have a few, but that's still like, maybe like a fraction of what the territories had been. And in the Northeast, they would be the biggest. And I'm sure they would spread out into some places like Ohio, West Virginia, places where there wasn't a lot of wrestling at the time, maybe start going into some parts of Canada. There would be that. And Gorilla would still be on things like HBO and the USA Network. So, I mean, they would be a presence, but it wouldn't be this monolithic entity that just crushed everybody. And I also think I would add to that I think the business probably in that form would have eventually died. I think it would have eventually just kind of dried up. Just like I really feel that what Vince did, I think, just because people say Vince made the business bigger than ever. It's not true. Vince made his business bigger than ever. Even he said that. He pretty much destroyed everything else. But I think if he hadn't have done that, I think it would have just slowly kind of wasted away. So, we're talking about 40 years later. And so what I mean is I don't think it would be around now. It might have lasted a good 10, 20 years, but I don't think it would be around now. I think what we'd have now, we might have indies and things, little underground things happening, but I think it would be looked at as sort of like an old school relic, like roller derby and things like that. Like it would be like that. So, I mean, it would just be very different.
Whatever happened to Phil Zacco, though? He just didn't want to be a part of it and got bought out, or did they kick him out?
No, they didn't kick him out. So the deal happened in 1982, and Phil Zacco was an old man. And, he probably would have done it for a little bit longer. But when the buyout happened, he just decided, okay, I'm going to take my money. He got like $300-something thousand out of the deal. I'm going to take my money and I'm going to retire. I'm going to go home. He was in his 70s. He was just done. And so he wasn't really an issue. Arnie Skoland, he had 10%. He was a very loyal guy, and he didn't have the kind of ambitions that, say, Gino had. And he just wanted to be a part of it. And I don't think he was the major obstacle. It was Gorilla that was the obstacle. Once Vince got his dad on his side, then it became like a political thing. And I write in the book, what would Gorilla have done if he chose to oppose it? I mean, it might have gone to litigation. If he lost, what then? He's got nothing. He hasn't never really worked outside of wrestling other than some brief jobs before he got into wrestling. He was a teacher. He was a construction worker, very short amounts of time. What is he going to go back to that? There were options. There were nuclear options. It's in the book of what the McMahons could have done if it came down to litigation. They could have dissolved the entire company and started a new one. And then those guys would all be out in the cold. They could have tried that. They could have forced the hand because Vince Sr. had 50%. So, he was the majority shareholder. It could have gotten ugly. But in the end, they made Gorilla enough of a deal that he was happy with it, and he signed the papers.
Does he, or did he always love being like the lead announcer? Was that a part of it? Is that like what Vince wanted? Is that what he wanted? Like, how does that kind of happen?
That was part of his deal. His deal was he had a couple of major conditions in there, and he was very proud. In later years, he talked to people. He was very proud of how he got Vince, how he had the leverage over Vince and got him to give him everything he wanted. He wanted to be on TV, so he didn't want to just fade away. Put me on TV. And so the most obvious way to do that was as a commentator, because they knew he was good at it. He had done some guest commentating and things, and I'm sure he advocated for that as well. And the other part of the deal was that he was to be paid 1.5 times opening match salary for every WWF event that was put on anywhere, whether he was there or not.
Wow.
Now, that is an incredible deal. And that is where he made his most money. And he wound up, because of how the WWF was running in those days, 2-3 shows a day, 30 plus house shows a month. He wound up actually making better money than he ever made as a part owner. He was making significant multiples of 6 figures for sure from that. However, he had to know in the back of his mind, especially when it exploded, that even though he was making the best money of his life, if he had been allowed to hang on to his shares, he would be many, many, many times richer than that. And so he sort of made the best with the hand that he was dealt. Because like I wrote in the book, Vince bought it from them for $1.7 million. And he sold it for $9 billion. So all you got to do is do the math. Gorilla's plan had been to hold on to the shares for life, to leave them to his children when he died. Like, he had it all worked out. Those shares would be worth well over $1 billion, close to $2 billion today.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is crazy. Oh my God. If you think about it, if he sold for $9 billion, that's crazy though. Wow. Man, he got a little bit of screw job there. Yeah.
Well,
sure.
that's what Senior thought he was going to do, because the idea was Vince Senior wanted to retire. He was also not in good health. He wanted to get out. He had 50%. He was thinking, who am I going to sell this to? And so at one point, he tried a few different people. They didn't have the money. At one point, his thinking was, I'm just going to take my 50% and split it among the partners and just sell it to them, sell it to Gino and Zacho and Arnie. And if that happened, that would be the moment where Gorilla would have taken over, because Zacho would have taken his money and probably been a silent partner and just, kind of let the money roll in. He was getting old. Arnie would have been a minority partner and would have gone along with anything. And Gorilla at that point would have been at least a 40% owner, if not more. And that's the moment when Vince swoops in, Vince Jr., and says, don't do that. Don't do that. And he convinces his dad, and his dad is on board. I'm going to sell you. Okay, I'll sell you my half. And that's when Vince says, it's not really what I had in mind. I want 100%. I don't just want your shares. I want everybody's shares. And that's where the difficulty began, because they were all in the beginning like, well, why? Who are you? You're not even a proven entity. What did you even do? You did this dumb, evil Knievel thing that lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. You failed at every job you've ever had outside of wrestling. There was real fear. The whole thing's going to go down the drain, It was not as smooth and happy and rosy like I think it's sometimes portrayed as.
Right. And like, where's he going to get the money to pay his dad back? And right. I mean, like, he doesn't have that money.
Right. As it turned out, a large portion of it was coming from the company itself, which is insane. Nobody would have ever been allowed to do that. Any other potential buyer except the boss's son. He was actually using company profits to pay the people that he was buying out. I mean, it boggles the imagination.
Right. You can't get away with that unless you're the boss's son, basically, or the owner's son.
And not all of it. Some of it was, they were taking out loans from banks. They were doing whatever they could. And then at the last minute, the 11th hour, they had a deal where it was 12 months. So that's another thing people don't always realize. It wasn't an instantaneous thing like June 19th, 1982, Vince takes over. Boom. No, it was a year-long transition process that goes all the way to the summer of 83. And he was supposed to pay monthly installments. When it came time to the last installment, he didn't have it. And they gave him a grace period, which had been built into the deal. It was an optional grace period. And they chose to do that. And they gave him like another month. And that is also another reason why he was so loyal to those guys to the end. Especially, Zacho retired, but especially Arnie and Gino. He was eternally loyal to the grace that they gave him in that moment. And they came up with the money days away from the drop dead deadline, where at that point, what would have happened is the shares would have all reverted back to the owners, and they would have even been able to keep the money that they got paid. So Vince would have really been screwed if he couldn't come up with that money. Yeah.
Wow. What a risk by Vince.
Yeah. Big one.
Paid off, obviously, as we know.
I would say it did.
Later, yeah.
he did all right for himself.
Yeah, that Vince guy. Yeah. The great thing that I love this joke, because I basically stole it from Hogan making fun of Bischoff, saying without him, Bischoff would be selling meat on the back of a truck in Minneapolis, like that joke. So I would say without Hogan, Vince is going to be selling homemade hot dogs in his New Hampshire hockey arena without Hogan, right? So Hogan's a big help there for Vince, paying, obviously making a ton of money. Yeah,
I mean, Vince, it's true. He was leaning on his dad for money at certain points. He had, 2 small children. It was a little scary. Like, he worked all these different jobs for a while because his dad wasn't thrilled about having him be in the business. So he worked at a rock quarry, driving a truck. He got involved with real estate deals that fell apart. He was a salesman selling like paper cups and things. That didn't work out. He was not viewed in the best of lights back then by his elders in the business, like a lot of promoters' sons are not.
It's crazy because like he takes over, Hogan era hits, and Gorilla has the greatest line. I feel like everyone, like, now you kind of steal lines like that you want as being like a one-liner, like, hey, you got, hit the sound bites, if you will, the great JR, like, it's all about sound bites. Hulkamania is here. Like that's the Gorilla line, and like literally sets off the whole thing. Gorilla Monsoon's voice, Hulkamania is here. Even the way he says it is perfect.
Yes, and I tried to recreate that in the audiobook because I just finished recording the audiobook. I forget the line before that. I did the whole thing. I forget what it is. History has been made, and the crowd is at their feet, or something like that. Here in Madison Square Garden, Hulkamania is here. Right. I tried to do that because it's him and Pat Patterson on the call for that, and so he literally ushered in the whole era of Hulkamania.
And just like JR did with Austin, the Austin era, Austin, the Austin era has begun, and it's Steve Austin, and him say it 3 times kind of thing, and really get it over. Gorilla did that with Hogan and the Hogan era. It's amazing. He's the voice of WWF.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, there's Vince too, but the thing I think that put Gorilla over the top was that he was doing all the big pay-per-views,
Yeah.
He's the voice of WrestleMania for the first 8 years of WrestleMania.
Yep.
And Vince had his superstars of wrestling, and he had the Saturday night's main event. But Gorilla was right up there with him.
When you look at that, right? Did Vince want to be the lead announcer over Gorilla, and because of the contract he couldn't, or was that he was perfectly fine with letting Gorilla be the lead announcer?
Well, you mean for the pay-per-views?
Yeah, like for the big shows. Yeah, because that's like what everybody remembers is the big shows.
I think Vince wanted it that way because Vince wanted to be able to run the shows. And if he was and like roll up his sleeves and get in there and run the shows. And so with someone else doing commentary, he was able to do that. Because with Vince, Vince had been stuck with commentary for like 15 years by this point, 12 years, 13 years. He did both weekly shows that the WWF had back in the day before the expansion. He did the Garden by himself every month, alone. He didn't even have a partner. And I think he had really really wanted to step away. And immediately when he takes over, Gorilla starts doing the Garden, for example. And, the other show is now eventually given to Gorilla to do. And Vince will take just one. And it's interesting that when it comes to NBC, Vince makes sure that he's right there on network television, with Jesse Ventura. But I think one of the things with Vince is it was kind of a blessing and a curse. I think Vince was always in the back of his mind wanting to step away completely from commentary, but he didn't fully trust people enough to do it without him. And there's years and years of struggle with this, where he's constantly looking for people to come up to replace him potentially, and it eventually becomes JR, and also to replace Gorilla, which also becomes JR, but that takes a long time. Like even when he first brings like when Gorilla's being phased out and JR is there, but JR is coming and going, and he's on Vince's bad side. He gets fired a couple of times. That's really the beginning of where Vince starts stepping in more than ever. Like Vince starts doing pay-per-views at that point, which he never used to do in the mid 90s. Vince is doing Monday Night Raw in the beginning, not Gorilla, and not JR. And so I think there was much more of a like frustration. Like, God damn it, I can't find anybody to do this. I'm going to just do it myself. Because Gorilla was getting older and getting sicker and not as dependable. He was missing. He had several heart attacks and things, and missing and surgeries, and he's missing TV. So I think when JR finally settles in there after Montreal, when Vince decides to fully step away and trust JR, and then become a heel TV character.
Yeah. When you look at too, with like Gorilla, when he's doing the WrestleManias, obviously Jesse is his main guy for all the big shows, the pay-per-views, if you will. What did you think about the chemistry with Jesse and Gorilla? Because I thought it was perfect. Like I thought those two were awesome. But a lot of people always go, "Oh, I like Vince with Jesse, and I like Gorilla with Heenan." But what do you think about Jesse and Gorilla?
I thought they were great. I thought they were such a solid team. They were great to have for those big shows because they brought a certain level of big match feel to what they were doing.
Yes.
I thought Gorilla and Heenan were hilarious and they were fantastic, but what they did was more comedy. And I think what Vince was looking for was something a little bit more dramatic. And that's what Gorilla and Jesse did, where the thing that was great about their commentary was you always felt that they were equals. They were peers. Gorilla was on the good side. Jesse was on the bad side, but not so over the top that they wouldn't occasionally agree with each other or concede points to each other and things. That would happen. And you got the sense that they respected each other as equals. Whereas the Gorilla Bobby dynamic was much different. It was Abbott and Costello. It was, one guy is so over the top in favor of the heels that it's ridiculous. And this caused Gorilla to become even more of a cheerleader for the baby faces than he had ever been before as a counterpoint. So it's a very different dynamic. It's hard to compare. I think with Gorilla and Bobby, they're more out and out entertaining as a team themselves. But with Gorilla and Jesse, I think that they were a better team to enhance the actual action happening in the ring, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like they themselves as a team were not the most entertaining part of the show, whereas sometimes Gorilla and Bobby could be the most entertaining part of the show. Gorilla and Jesse more kind of like contributed to what was happening on the screen. So it was a different kind of vibe.
Definitely. With Heenan and Gorilla, even prime time, it's funny. It's like they're just going to go back and forth. These two are going to be chirping. It's like a comedy routine, basically.
Yeah, they're like an old married couple half the time.
Yeah, definitely. And with Jesse and Gorilla, and maybe I'm just crazy as a fan, but they actually made me like really care about who won and lost. Like, God, Hogan better win. Hogan, like Hogan has to win, as a kid. And Jesse's so against you. Like, man, this guy better be wrong. Like you are like physically, mentally, and emotionally invested in these two guys.
Because Jesse sounded like he knew what he was talking about. And so sometimes he would cause you to doubt things. Yes. Whereas with Bobby, I think even little kids felt like they were smarter than Bobby. Like that was his character. He was supposed to be the idiot who thinks he's brilliant. And that's great for kids. I always find that with any kind of children's entertainment, it's so important to have a character that the kids watching feel like they are smarter than. Like that gets kids really involved with what they're watching, and it makes it very funny. And I think that was Bobby's role. Like you never trusted what he said. You never thought, oh, maybe he's telling the truth. You knew like, oh, this guy is full of it. Give me a break. Just like Gorilla would say, very different heel commentators they were.
That's why Royal Rumble 92 is so shocking because like, there's no way Flair's winning. He's so over the top with his Flair stuff, and Gorilla's the exact opposite. Like, no way Flair's winning, and Flair wins, and Heenan goes nuts.
Yeah, that's their best moment to me is that Royal Rumble 92 as a team. Yep. They're so great, and you get Bobby losing his mind through the whole match. You have Gorilla, who's clearly enjoying Bobby squirming and Bobby being anxious. But then, like you said, Flair actually pulls it off from position number 3, wins the whole thing. And you have Gorilla, who is like begrudgingly respecting what Flair did and having to praise him for this incredible accomplishment. It makes it a very interesting match.
And Heenan was right. Why is Hogan pulling Sid out of the ring? Like, you can't be doing it. Like that's not the right sportsmanship thing to do. Hulk, come on.
Right. That might have been the one and only time where the fans were on Bobby Heenan's side and against Gorilla Monsoon, because Gorilla was poo-pooing Bobby as usual. Yeah. And you're watching, you're going, I think Heenan might have a point here this time.
You know what, though, with Gorilla, I trusted him so much. And I was obviously big Hulkamaniac. And when he's talking about Hulk, he goes, the greatest professional athlete. Like, I believed it forever. I'm like, this guy's better than Jordan, right?
Yep. I would think in my head, like when he would say that, like, even then, I think, wow, that really covers a lot of ground. I'm thinking in my head, like Mike Tyson, Michael Jordan.
Yeah.
Wow, that's really something.
Yeah,
Don Mattingly.
Like,
wow.
Crap,
okay. Yeah. Amazing. That's impressive,
So true. Did he love the Hulkster? Because he puts him over, and obviously he's the one, like the cash guy, who's making everybody all the money. But did he really like Hulk?
I think I don't know if they were pals. I don't think they were. I don't think he was like one of his close pals in the business in real life. Part of it was this, and there was a lot of drug culture in the WWF in that era, and Gorilla was not a fan of that at all. Like very much zero tolerance about those kind of things, like recreational drugs. And and that was his generation too, because I mean, even just anything, even like marijuana, like he was just known to be really, really bothered by any of it. And his daughter Valerie told me a story that didn't make the book because it was something we didn't bother to talk about. But when Hogan died, I was talking to her about this, and at that point, I said, like, what did your dad think of Hulk? Like, I asked that question. What was the relationship like? And she made it seem like, he tolerated him, and he knew he was making the company a lot of money, but it's not like he was his favorite guy. And she told me this story about how Hulk Hogan had a big party at his house down in Florida at this time, and everybody was invited down. Everybody went down, all the wrestlers, everybody, Vince and everybody. And Gorilla came with his wife Maureen, and she said at one point everybody went upstairs and they were all doing drugs, and and I think probably hard drugs and cocaine or whatever. It was that era. Yeah. And Gorilla turned to Maureen and just said, let's get out of here. Let's go home. Just disgusted. And so I think that was the story she chose to tell me. So I think that was probably a summation of his attitude towards Hulk Hogan.
But he shows his professionalism. He did nothing but put him over on air.
Exactly. That is wrestling. That's the wrestling business.
Yes.
It's a work.
Yes.
It's a work, yep. Right? You know that, John, right?
Yes, of course. And you got to put over the cash cow. You got to.
That reminds me. Yeah, right. You got to put him over. Of course. Yeah. That's the bread and butter. You got to protect the guy. He's the golden goose. But that reminds me actually of another story that Valerie told me about, wrestling as a work and all this. So I asked her about the Vader thing. We were talking about that when Vader squashed Gorilla on Monday Night Raw, when Gorilla was the WWF president. And, he destroyed him on TV. Gave him 2 Vader bombs. Just, he was like dead. And Valerie said at the time she was not living with them anymore. She was living down in Cancun for a little while on her own. And she saw Monday Night Raw on TV at a local bar that she happened to be in. They had it on. And she saw this happen. And she was like kind of taken aback and looking at it like, oh man, is he okay? And she got home and she said she had all these messages on her answering machine, like from friends and people. Is your dad okay? Did you see what happened on Raw? And she said, I called my dad at home. He picked up the phone and, how you doing, Val? And she's like, Dad, are you okay? He goes, well, what do you mean, am I okay? She says, well, I saw on TV, am I okay? And are you okay? What happened? And he goes, don't be a mark. Come on. I'm fine. What's the matter with you? Just thought she was being ridiculous, but
that's great.
That's wrestling.
Wow. That is great. You would think he'd be like, I'm a little hurt, honey. And Vader.
Nope. Said, wow. Come on, don't be a mark.
That's awesome. That's great. I love it though, because obviously he's working a bit saying Hogan's the greatest professional athlete because he's the cash cow. But I feel like he shoots on some of the guys, like we talked about last week, Bret Hart and like Jim Brunzell. Yeah. Like I think he really likes some of those guys.
Yes, Jim Brunzell, right? Bret Hart, Cowboy Bob Orton, Ricky Steamboat. There were guys who he genuinely enjoyed in the ring. None of those guys had their noses clean either, but, he enjoyed what they did in the ring. He respected their work for sure. He was somebody who he really liked seeing a great wrestling match, and he was a big fan of that. And, it's easy to sort of say, because he had other sayings like Bobby Heenan once said that Gorilla said to him, if you're not in this business for the money, you're a fool. And I'm sure he did say that. And I'm sure to a certain degree he believed that. But that's not to say that he didn't. He also had a great love for the business. He did. And he had a great respect for the craft of professional wrestling. And he came from a generation, everybody likes to say their generation was the best. he came up in the 60s and 70s, and he saw some of the greatest to ever do it. And he was still seeing a lot of those guys in the 80s doing it, that were lingering on. And he had a great love for the craft of wrestling. Now, conversely, when it starts going into the 90s, he starts losing patience with a lot of the newer guys because their work, in his opinion, is not really up to snuff. Bret Hart, however, was not one of those guys, and he thought he was great, and he was thrilled when Bret became one of the top guys, because he was in favor of doing that for years. And so he was very much a proponent of Bret Hart's. Yeah. And he also, Steve Austin, as a worker, had a lot of great respect for him, was not a fan of the language and all the edgy attitude era stuff. But as a worker, he loved Austin.
And it's just one of those things with Gorilla. He, like you said, 60s and 70s, he's fighting Bruno, and he's having these big feuds, and he eventually meets up with Muhammad Ali at one point. I mean, he's just got these big moments, but he also lived through as a commentator all these different eras. So he's probably, as it progresses, like, oh my God, what is it turning into here? This guy's giving the middle finger and drinking beer and everything.
Yeah, and that's what I got from a lot of people. I remember Kevin Kelly told me that, who was around Gorilla in the later years there, how Gorilla had seen the best of the best. And especially, this was his point of view too, Gorilla's point of view. He'd seen the best of the best. He'd seen all the salad years for the company. Now the company's on its ass, and these new guys are coming in, some of whom are terrible. Look, we've all seen the mid-90s WWF, right? Gorilla was there watching it too, okay? Just like we were, and thinking, what in the hell is going on here? Jim Ross talks about times where he had to talk him off the ledge, where they'd be doing voiceovers together, and Gorilla's frustration is coming through on the commentary. And Jim had to take him outside. Let's have a cigarette, take it easy, catch your breath. We have a job to do here, and sort of bring him back to where he needed to be. He was very frustrated with some of the things he saw in the 90s.
Yeah, there's some Coliseum videos in like the mid 90s, like where he's doing with Johnny Polo or Stan Lane, and you could tell he's just like literally ribbing or just annoyed at some of the stuff. But then there'll be like a Bret Hart, Owen Hart, Steiner Brothers match, and he'll be into it. But then he'll make fun of Pat Patterson, or he'll make fun of the agents. But you can tell he's like ornery at that. Like he's like, oh God, what's going on? What's coming up next?
Yeah, that's very true. It kind of reminds me of like the old Sinatra, when he would be really grumpy and angry.
Yeah,
I'm a big Sinatra fan, and as the music industry changed, and he just gets grumpier and angrier, and you could even tell on some of his records in the later years, he'll be singing a song, and you could tell that he hates the song that he's singing, but some A&R guy got in his ear and said, "Frank, you got to do this. It's going to be a big hit."
Right,
That's kind of where Gorilla was in the later years.
Yeah, come on, Gorilla, just do it. And JR is kind of whispering in his ear, come on, just do it. Like, you got to just get it, get with it here.
We got to get through this, right? We got to get these guys over. And also because in those later years, Gorilla was less invested, I think, emotionally. He lost Joey. He was, despondent. He was losing his faith in the company because it was hurting so bad. And he just cared a lot less. It's just the way it was.
So as we hit the wind down here, head towards the finish, do you have a favorite time period of Gorilla? Like when you're writing the book, do you have like a favorite time period where it really like sparks you and you're like, wow, this was the best?
Well, my favorite time period to actually write about would be, even though before my time, would be his peak wrestling years in the 60s. I got such enjoyment from writing about that all through the 60s, because that's a period that is probably of all his active career is the least known about in detail, and yet it's the most high profile part of his entire wrestling career. And let's say 63 to 69, but even the early 60s, when he's still bouncing around the territories, I found it fascinating, because what I wanted to do is give that level of granular detail for that era, just like we have for the 80s and 90s, where people won't shut up about it. There's been a million books and documentaries. Yeah. We know how many times Vince took a crap on this date. I'm sorry, that's the wrong reference to make, but we know how many times Hulk Hogan, farted on June 4th, 1987. But when you go back to the 60s, it's like mystery, and we don't, the details aren't often talked about for that company. And I wanted to do that in this book, and I feel like I did. So it was like discovering all this great stuff that happened and breaking some myths too. And even what's beautiful is in some of the newspapers, they were still covering pro wrestling in the newspapers in detail. Like they would have reporters at ringside. So for matches where there's no footage, which is pretty much all of them in that time period, I have blow-by-blow descriptions from sports writers. So I'm able to create visual pictures of some of these matches, and I loved doing that.
That's so cool. Did you ever get a chance to work on them? What year did you work in WWF? I know obviously you worked for many years, but what year did you start?
I started in 2000, so he was gone.
Oh, he was gone in 99,
and I came in to interview in October 99. It was about 10 days after he died. So I missed him. I very nearly missed him. Yeah. And in fact, one of my first days there, when I first got there, I got an interoffice envelope on my desk and had his name at the top. So he was one of the people that had gotten that, those envelopes where you could see everybody who's had the envelope, right?
Yep.
At the very top of the grid, it just said Gorilla. And it's just one of those tingly moments. I remember just standing there looking at the envelope and just in awe, like this is real. He was here, but that's how close I came to meeting him.
You're like Kramer when he gets that inter-office envelope from Costanza and he's looking at it. He's like, oh, my God.
Everyone does that. If you've ever gotten an inter-office envelope in your life, I don't care who you are, where you worked, you are looking up that grid to see who had it before you. And sometimes, depending where you work, people make incredible discoveries, like who had this envelope. Everyone.
Gorilla, I mean, forget about it. Tippy top of the food chain there. It's like, holy shit, Gorilla Monsoon had this thing? God damn.
Yep.
I was at WrestleMania 15. I was there front row. I saw Gorilla, basically his last appearance. That obviously did not look in good health, but great to see him one final time.
Yeah, that's the book opens with that scene. That's how I wanted to open it, with his last public appearance at WrestleMania 15, and then kind of set the table from there and go back to the beginning.
So where can everybody get the Irresistible Force, the Life and Times of Gorilla Monsoon? Where can everybody get it?
Well, thankfully, I have ECW Press as my publisher. Simon & Schuster's the distributor. So, it's a wide publication release. You can get it in print or digital wherever books are sold. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, all the big chains. You can go to your local neighborhood bookstore if you have one, and they'll probably have it. If they don't get it in, you can have them order it for you. In Canada, you could even buy directly from ECW Press, because they're in Canada, and outside Canada, the postage is a little high from Canada. So also about the audiobook, because people have asked me that. The audiobook I'm wrapping up the finishing touches on it tomorrow as we speak. And I've been told that it will be available sometime next month, which sounds to me like an incredible turnaround, but I guess because there's not really anything physical that they produce nowadays with an audiobook. It's all digital audio files. So it should be available pretty soon as well.
Nice. Love that. Where can everybody find and follow you as far as social media?
Sure. Well, I'm on Twitter at Brian R. Solomon. I'm also on Instagram there. I've got my podcast, Shut Up and Wrestle with Brian R. Solomon. Get it wherever you find your podcasts. And the Facebook group for that is Shut Up and Wrestle with Brian R. Solomon. And I even have a Patreon for people that want a little bit more content from me. It's patreon.com/Shut Up and Wrestle. And one of the things I do on there are watch-along commentaries for major historical wrestling events. And that's really like the bread and butter of the Patreon.
Nice. Love that. Everybody should check out Shut Up and Wrestle, of course. And, of course, check out The Irresistible Force, The Life and Times of Gorilla Monsoon. Great book. Check it out. Brian, thank you so much for all the time. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, John. Thanks for having me.